Well, it's sort of traditional, I guess. They say a woman's place is in the home, and I suppose as long as she's in the home, she might as well be in the kitchen.
This is a man's world, but it wouldn't be nothing without a woman or a girl.
There's never been a time in civilized history that women have not been deemed inferior to men. Since the day man set foot on American soil, American women have faced serious systematic oppression across the nation. Throughout history, women have been constantly fighting for equal rights under the law, including the right to vote. Today, the right to vote is considered a basic right for all American citizens, regardless of their gender or race. However, this wasn't always the case. In the early 20th century, Husted Harper worked alongside Susan B. Anthony in a stand against female oppression. Through letters and public speaking, she was able to gain support for the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote and gave them a purpose beyond being a male subordinate. The Forgotten Feminist. Husted Harper stand for women's rights. The beginning of the women's rights movement in America gave rise to a vocal and courageous group of women who argued for social and political equality to men. In the early 20th century, social and political inequality between men and women sparked a whirlwind of agitation amongst thousands of American citizens. Like most women of the time, Husted Harper was a victim to a previously established domestic system that limited the expectations and abilities of women. In America, men and women were expected to feel separate spheres in society. The American feminine ideal illustrated a self-denying, helpless, and demure homemaker that remained home while her husband worked. While men participated as working and functioning members of political and social environments, women were expected to lead the life of a housewife, taking care of cooking, cleaning, and the welfare of the children, all while perfectly embodying an attractive and perfectly dressed wife and mother. Men of the time only aided these disastrous views, supporting the idea that women were not capable of participating in politics because they feared exposure would indirectly degrade their role as a man. In fact, Dr. A. Hughes Bennett, a popular scientist of the time, stated that women had a smaller mental capacity simply because their brains were smaller. In his opinion, women were more nervous and hysterical, and therefore more talented in non-essential detail work, and generally suited for only marriage and child rearing. Views like Dr. Bennett's and other prominent men of the time were widely transmitted into ladies' magazines and newspapers across the country. Many newspapers depicted women who did not fit commonly accepted gender norms as unladylike and unattractive beings who failed to reach the female goal of marriage and womanhood. Due to these traditional expectations, very few women had opportunities for education and jobs that were even a fraction of those offered to men.
Women were often imprisoned for staging public marches. They were insulted. They had, again, debris thrown at them. People spit upon them when they were carrying signs and wearing banners promoting.
This lack of representation angered Husted Harper, who was eager to change the social perception of women. Born an Indiana native on February 18, 1851, Harper was no stranger to the social and economic oppression that women faced in America. Throughout her early years, she moved around Indiana frequently, switching places to cover job offerings and further her education. In 1871, Harper married Thomas W. Harper and settled in Terre Haute, Indiana. From there, she started her early stands in the movement, writing and editing newspapers using a male pseudonym despite her husband's disapproval. It wasn't until 1881 that her authorship was finally recognized in a column called A Woman's Opinion, in which she shared her perspective on issues in society. From the early 1880s to 1890, Harper wrote nearly 400 articles for the Saturday Evening Mail and Terre Haute Daily News. In her articles, she was a devoted advocate and defender of women's rights, and never hesitated to state her unconventional views, whether they were widely accepted or not. Harper worked passionately on womanhood, marriage, divorce, careers, education, and suffrage, which were all gradually added to her overall concept of women's rights. Newspapers that had once been used as a source of unattainable female ideals were now being used as tools of empowerment and enlightenment. Her work was recognized by many, and in 1887 she was made the secretary of the Indiana chapter of the National Women's Suffrage Association. Her writings continued to prove detrimental to her marriage, and eventually led to her divorce from her husband after constant arguments over her participation. Despite the end of her marriage, Harper continued her fight for women's suffrage, and moved to California to further the movement as a prominent leader. In California, Harper began working alongside one of her newly accompanied and well-known friend, Susan B. Anthony. Together they traveled across the nation, hosting many events and speeches to raise awareness. In 1896, Anthony placed Harper in charge of the national publicity of the women's suffrage movement, and she wrote hundreds of letters over the course of 3 years to paper editors and newspapers to gain support for the federal suffrage amendment. In her writings, she expressed that women were moral superiors of men, and that their participation in activities traditionally prescribed to men would raise the quality of those activities. She also placed the systematic oppression of women on men, whom she believed made the laws and established the customs that barred women from equality. Ultimately, her constant urges on men to stand up and make a difference finally proved to be successful when the 19th Amendment was passed. This amendment granted women the right to vote, pushing them further towards reaching the gender equality that so many fought for. Ida Husted Harper's actions were just the beginning of a long fight. A fight that took nearly 70 years to be ratified in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. As a result, women experienced economic progress and were enrolled in higher education to enter numerous professional occupations. For the first time in history, women were allowed to be viewed as individuals, rather than male subordinates. Now as individuals, they could have a voice that spread much farther than the confinements of their home, and seek education for themselves. Suffrage heavily impacted women in society, who began to understand that they too deserved equal rights. The reform not only encouraged women to advocate for themselves, but introduced a new social system to America. Soon the nation, and even the world, began to realize that women were capable of life outside the house, which prompted movements and opportunities that this nation had never seen. Women across the globe began taking action, pushing to improve the rights of citizens everywhere. The women's rights movement also did not stop at gaining the right to vote. Instead, the 19th Amendment stood as motivation and a constant reminder that through effective protest, minorities could receive the rights that they deserved. Unfortunately, gender bias continues to create huge barriers for women all around the world. However, tremendous progress has been made since the 19th century's fight for women's suffrage. Without the voices and actions heard from the likes of Harper, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and other suffragists of the time, women might still be fighting for the right to vote. Through lobbying, campaigning, and nonviolent protests, these women were able to gain the right to equality and redefine the women of American society. Each generation has its own minority fighting for a change. Today, the feminist campaign continues to fight for the equality of women all around the world. Women still suffer from being objectified, stereotyped, ostracized, and underpaid in the workforce. It is important to understand that gender roles are taught and learned. If Ida Husted Harper did not try to actively change the perception of what it meant to be a woman, it would have been impossible for the next generation to follow suit. Although as a nation there is progress to be made, Ida Husted Harper's actions will forever be held as acts of perseverance that changed the world forever.